Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might be.
Hello, everybody. Rick Wagner here, coming back around very quickly. It feels like the weeks are getting shorter all the time. We're on KGLN 980 and 101.3, KNZZ 1100 and 92.7. All my words are gone, I guess. I've used them all up this week. Well, a lot to talk about as usual, unfortunately. It would be nice if we just had kind of a quiet time, and we could just sit here and just kind of tell stories around the, sit around and whittle and maybe sit around the old Cracker Barrel and swap stories. But I think those days are long behind us. So we have a new pope. I guess the world and Roman Catholics have a new pope. I'm pleased that they have a new pope. I'm not a Roman Catholic per se, but many of you are, and so that's a good thing. I'm, as I mentioned in the past, I think I'm more the Lutheran persuasion. I thought that Martin Luther, was on record as saying that he, during writing some things, he was confronted by the devil and he threw an inkwell at the devil. So I figure anybody that's ready to mix it up right there, I kind of want them on my side. Anyway, there's just something going on with the papacy that I really don't understand anymore. I mean, granted, I am not tangled up in the Catholic religion at this point, but I have some historical background on it. It's very interesting, actually. And, for instance, many of you will know this anyway, but I always found it fascinating that the Pope is said to walk in the shoes of the fishermen. Many of you will know what I mean by that. I thought it was interesting because, remember, the first head of the Catholic Church was Peter. Peter was a fisherman. So the popes are said to walk in the shoes of the fishermen. I always thought that was kind of interesting. There's actually a movie called that. I want to say it was made in the, late 60s maybe. I think Anthony Quinn is in it as a discussion of how they chose a new pope. And, of course, there's a lot of intrigue and things like that around it. It was considered a little bit iconoclastic at the time, I believe. Now it's just considered to be quaint, considering how things go now. But the process is very interesting. The history, I think, is important. I think all of us, to some extent, want to have some sort of procedure in our lives. I don't know how else to say it, but there's something about a religious experience that's nice to have a construct around it. And this has been something that's formed over a long time. Catholic Church has had its problems. Recent problems are one thing. Historical problems with Borgias as popes and things like that. That's another thing. This pope, of course, that they've chosen after the last one is an American, which is a big deal. Popes traditionally had been Italian, and then they managed to work in the occasional European. And for those of you familiar with the history of the papacy, you had the Babylonian captivity. You had the two popes, where there was one at Avignon and one at Rome, and it's quite interesting in there. But nevertheless, an American pope is a very interesting thing. Now, of course, our friends, the Wall Street Journal, who occasionally have some sort of, I don't know if it's some sort of out-of-body experience or what it is, that they kind of lose the track of vague conservatism that they usually have, and said that this could be a problem for the Pope because he carries a United States passport. And right now, there's problems with, people with the United States passport, because of, the Trump thing, right? Now, I don't know where the Wall Street Journal gets off on that, and there's no evidence of that. And it's just, it's some off-the-cuff comment that somebody at the Wall Street Journal apparently came up with. I still enjoy the paper. I think, by the way, the Wall Street Journal report that you see plays on Fox sometimes and so forth, is an excellent piece of compact journalism and opinion. I really like it. And the paper itself is pretty good, but their opinion page is kind of all over the place, and in the sense that they really are quite married up to the United States Chamber of Commerce, for one thing, which can be in favor of things that we might find conservative and sometimes not so much. So I think the journal reflects that. They are, of course, very tuned to Wall Street. The Wall Street Journal. And like we've said here before, ignoring Wall Street because you think it's just rich people, these days especially, is ignoring usually where your pension funds are at or all sorts of things that are connected to you. It also has something to do with your health care because the pharma stocks out there, the MedPays, UMR, things like that, how they do affects how they function in the regular world. And so the vagaries of the market can end up affecting us sort of in a tertiary kind of way, right? Secondary or third kind of way that it kind of affects us. So it's worth noting that. But at any rate, so the American Pope, of course, and this is a complete surprise, has a long history of discussing things about President Trump that he doesn't like, which apparently are quite a few things. Now, why people feel the need in these kinds of positions, as a cardinal or whatever, to tweet, or go on X, I suppose now, and pop off with your semi-political opinions that you are attempting to ground as religious positions is beyond me. I refer to the phrase from the Bible, render those things that are Caesar's to Caesar, and render those things to God that is God's. Many of these people who have been popes and in other religious orders have not quite understood that dividing line and want to venture into it. And so he apparently has been very critical of the policies of Trump, deportation, immigration, and so forth. Which it's fine to have that as a personal opinion, but when you're the Pope or even a cardinal, it comes across as sort of an official position of who you're working for. And I've never thought that was very wise. And it also doesn't set the tone of how are we going to get along with the Pope. The Pope's position, historically, of course, has been very important and had great weight on certain things in time. Look at their crusades. But many of you will remember that there was a time in the 80s when we had John Paul II, who, in my opinion, was an excellent pope and a fine human. His commitment to human rights and being against, essentially, autocracy and tyranny and some of the things the Soviet Union was doing and so forth, not so much political as procedurally religious, that these things are wrong in the way we treat humans. Now, let's not forget, this is, of course, sort of the same theory that people pop off about, President Trump. Well, I'm doing the same thing. John Paul II was a little different. And I think many of you know that, and you can certainly look into it. But the combination of John Paul II, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher at the time was a deeply powerful movement for freedom and liberty, as we think of it, and pushing back against really some pretty dark forces at the time, and a fairly brave position by the Pope especially. And having those three people who were really pretty exceptional individuals kind of working in concert, I think brought about a lot of very positive things during that time. So you can have an effect. Of course, the effect you have has something to do with how capable you are as a person. For instance, you can have a lot of effect as a president directly by doing things, say like President Trump. You can have a lot of interesting things happen by letting other things just happen, and other people do whatever they want around you, sort of like President Biden. So you see that there is action by commission and omission. And we've had a great example of both recently. So I think we can examine those pretty well. The new Pope, well, But we'll see how that goes. Okay, we're back. Thanks for sticking around. I don't want to beat a dead horse here about the papacy because, there are other things to talk about too. But I would say that it's going to be very interesting to see how the new pope acts, because the last one was, I thought, and this is just my personal opinion, somewhat problematic. Only in the sense that he was very involved in things that seemed to straddle the fence between religious doctrine and political positions. Now, we know that happens, and we were just talking about John Paul II, who in many ways did that as well. But his positions were, I think, grounded a little differently. But perhaps I'm just biased because he worked so well with Thatcher and Reagan. But if you looked at the doctrinal changes that have occurred in the Catholic Church over time, it's been very interesting. And the last pope was an interesting character when it comes to adherence to what I thought was fairly settled doctrine of the Church. So we will see how this guy reacts. I suspect he's going to be outspoken and critical, and that's fine if he comes from a position of religious belief and grounding. That's his job. But let's just not cross over too much like we've seen from time to time. Like I say, I'm well aware that John Paul II had done a fair amount of that, and perhaps I'm biased because I appreciated his direction. But he also had a different way about him, and you cannot extract the personality of the person from their effect in the world. You can have the same policies, more or less, of Ronald Reagan, but you're not Ronald Reagan. You're never going to be able to have the same effect. Same thing with Margaret Thatcher. There is a unique piece to people like that, of call it charisma, drive, inability to get beaten down, you name it, and that contributes to how they operate and their success or failure. That is sort of intangible, but I think we know it when we see it. It's one of those kinds of things. Now, moving on a bit, just some troubling news out of Washington. Now, this is, of course, the Trump presidency, which is moving at warp speed, as we would say, in all sorts of directions. Of course, it is trying to be held up by various loon district court judges on the federal bench here and there, some of which are vastly overreaching their, I think, even perceived jurisdiction. We're going to have to deal with that. But it also is a good thing in one interesting way, is whenever these things are revealed, right, and brought under the light where they can be dealt with, that's probably a good thing. So these kinds of things that are going on with Trump and some of the decisions about his policies, some of which probably you can say, okay, that's probably within the court's purview to oversee that, whether or not, there's someone outside racing, I guess, whether or not that purview extends to giving an order to cover the entire United States from your district court bench is an entirely second question, but there are some things that are probably within the province of, constitutionality that we can look at. Others that just don't seem to be any of the court's business, and that specifically are not supposed to be the court's business. The Aliens Act that the President has been acting under has been around for a long time. I think, 1798? And it's been tested quite a few times. Now, is the way that Trump is enacting it something that can be scrutinized? I suppose so. Do practicalities and application of certain parts of the Constitution, are they in place for non-citizens? This has just been a problem for a long time. Obviously, we believe that individuals, wherever they may hail from or being here, have certain inalienable human rights that they carry with them, no matter where they're at. How much we acknowledge those and give them the protection of our form of government is the question. If you are illegally in the country, my argument would be that those protections are very lightly given to you. They are more of a consideration of humanity and treating everybody as well as we can, as opposed to you have just as many rights as a citizen. If you look at some of these decisions from the courts, or their opinions, I suppose, you would think that just rolling into the United States from, Saskatchewan or wherever, the minute that you touch base over here, you have an indistinguishable amount of privileges and rights from a citizen. Well, if that's true, what's the point of citizenship? We've asked that many times here. This is a core question you have to go back to. When citizenship is difficult to separate from just residency, just being there, in terms of rights, abilities, all these sorts of things, what does that mean to the nation? What does that say about your, quote, citizens? Who are they in this calculation? And once again, I come back to the phrase, what's the point if you're going to allow no differentiation or make it very hazy? The courts, particularly the liberal ones, are very hesitant to draw a line between citizens and non-citizens because, well, there's a lot of reasons why they want to do it. They disagree, I think, with the Constitution, or they believe that everybody's exactly the same in terms of, well, under the Eyes law, everyone's the same. Well, no, that's not true. And we all know that. We all are equal under the law in the sense that it is applied to us, should be applied to us equally. But it doesn't mean that your situation doesn't determine how the law affects you. Whether you're a citizen or not, whether you're on parole or not, whether or not you're a repeat offender, these kinds of things. Obviously, your status has something to do with how you are affected by the Constitution and the rights that it carries with us. We don't allow, for instance, felons of certain types to necessarily be involved with firearms, at least for a certain period of time. You may think that's a good or bad idea, but nevertheless we do that, and that's been thought to be all right. These people are citizens, and yet we feel that that's within our power. Now, what the line is on some of that is very elastic, apparently. Here in Colorado, apparently that people who don't know one end of a firearm from the other, which is a dangerous thing, by the way, are going to tell people how they should defend themselves, what kind of instrumentalities they should use, how they should store them, what they should look like, you name it. And that's not a good idea for anything. I don't care if you're describing how to use, a table saw. People who don't know what they're talking about shouldn't be telling you how to use it. And yet we have this. And I think that sort of infringement is something that the Constitution tries to protect from. Because remember, the Constitution guarantees not your rights. You have these rights anyway, according to the Constitution and according to the Federalist Papers and the Founders. It guarantees that the amount of infringement that the government can place on these rights is limited. So you can't get that turned upside down. And I can't say this enough, and I know other people say it, and I've said it many times. The Constitution does not give you rights. The Constitution guarantees a certain level of non-interference from the government in the rights you already possess. It seems like a simple enough thing, but some people can never seem to get their head around it. And speaking of get your head around things, not to jump around too much, I just hear these troubling stories out of Washington lately about our tax policy. You see, the tax policy and how it is imposed on citizenry is an interesting piece anyway, right? We have a constitutional amendment that allows an income tax. The Constitution itself did not, I don't think. So monkeying around with the income tax or taxation in general should be something that we're all paying attention to. Not because it hits our pocketbook, which we should be worried about, but because it is an exercise in control over the economy and the individuals by economic manipulation, which is very important. And I see in this tax bill, this big, beautiful bill that President Trump wants, that there are a certain group of, I use Republicans sort of with air quotes around them, that believe that we need to raise taxes on people above a certain income level. because they want to pay for these tax cuts for no tax on tips, tax on overtime, eliminating some of the tax on Social Security and so forth. And I think that's sad because it demonstrates, and maybe we need to see this, that these people have no real belief in the idea that there is a certain point of taxation where you get more revenue because the economic engine is allowed to run on a much freer way than it is when it's burdened by a tax code. The Laffer curve. I think it's been shown again and again that at a certain point of taxation, which is lower than we're at now, by the way, you have robust economy. Robust economy generates taxes. Even though they're collected at a lower rate, there's more of them, and you collect more revenue with less paying to the taxpayer. These guys just cannot let go of that. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, everybody, we're back for our third segment here. I appreciate it. Rick Wagner getting it right here. I just can't get the tax thing off my mind. I just don't understand. Are we back to George H.W. Bush again? Read my lips, no new taxes, and then, new taxes. Is that what's going on with these? I just don't see it. What they're discussing, and this is just a few oddball Republicans, but you never know how this is going to go. Having a higher tax rate on people to make over $2.5 million a year, as I suppose is an adjusted income. Well, they wanted to go from, I think, 35.6 to like 39 point something percent. And you're like, oh, well, that's okay, isn't it? No, it's not. I don't care how much money you make. It shouldn't be okay just to come take it because you have it. That's like saying the bank has a lot of money, so it was okay if Bonnie and Clyde just took some of it. It's just, and I know, see, we need taxes. Don't get me wrong. We have to be able to do things like public safety, which seems to be slipping away in many places. Roads also slipping away. Well, what are we doing well now? I don't know. I think we're on the road to recovery with the present administration in Washington. Certainly not on the road to recovery in the state I'm at, Colorado. We are careening down the path to fiscal and, I guess, probably mental oblivion. But if you just think about taxes, who uses more of the taxes? Do you think Bill Gates, who I think is a creepy dude, but had a lot of good ideas, uses a lot of, services? Probably not. So what's the theory of taking more money from him? I guess it's because he has it, right? We keep coming back to that with this increased taxation idea. Last segment, we talked about the Laffer curve, Arthur Laffer. And if you want to see some just weird things on the internet, see what people will say about the Laffer curve. Every time you ask something about it, you'll get, particularly in some of the AIs, you'll get this, well, a lot of other economists dispute this. Well, I don't know how you can. Now, I'm not saying that Art Laffer has the exact formula here, but there certainly is a place in taxation where we can see that the rate is in a range where people will pay it and still have enough. What happens when you take a lot of taxes from someone? That's right. You take the money out of the system. You cripple their ability to grow their businesses, to buy goods and services, and do all the things that makes the economy grow. And where do you take it? You take it to government, which does not produce anything, which is supposed to just help regulate. It's supposed to smooth the way for business and personal liberty. Instead, it sort of runs sort of like running into the other football team as you're trying to run back a punt. That's how government's been acting the last few years. So where does the idea that we need that much of everybody else's money, even when you look at the just statistics, perhaps about 30% of taxation, the way it's structured now, is probably the most. Of course, we're not there yet. I mean, we're past that. Some people pay less, and this is the problem with the tax codes, are your adjusted gross income, as those of you that do your own taxes know, is kind of a floating figure depending on the kind of deductions you have, exemptions, things like that. And the government likes to mess around with this stuff by giving you tax credits, and so it's hard to really zero in on that sometimes. And the tax code is such that your rate is determined by, of course, the end result of your adjusted gross income. And you pay tax based on a stair step. So certain amount of money pays, let's say, 10%. And then another amount, then after that, the money gets taxed at 20%, goes up like that. It's not like you hit a bell rings and all of your money is taxed at the highest rate. That's not how that works. So it's a little more complex than people would have you believe, and you know that if you do your taxes. And most of you know something is the fact that you see your money disappear and you think, where did that go? And then you look out the window at the potholes in front of your house and the inability to have enough law enforcement in your area and some just crazy stuff that people are doing with their tax money downtown, and you say, oh, so that's what's going on. Anyway, you can do some of your own research, but it's clear that there is a range that you can take enough funds to make the government run, leave money in people's pockets so that they can fuel the economy, grow businesses, buy stuff, things like that, and that will generate taxation, although at a lower rate, like we said last segment, but more money. So do you want 70% of $100, or do you want 50%, let's just say, of $1,000? I think 50% is probably not a very good example, but that's what we're talking about. And when we see some of these folks who claim to be conservatives, Republicans, libertarians, I don't know what they think they are, who are like, well, we should have at the very top, we've got to pay for all these tax cuts we're going to do. No tax on tips, Social Security, overtime, where's the money going to come from? Well, if you're at a correct tax rate, the money will come to the government by people spending more of the money they have, either on upgrading their businesses or buying things they think they need, not holding back, not holding back on buying goods and services that maybe aren't completely essential. That's where it comes from. The problem we get with people who are, so-called Republicans, I suppose, certainly not conservatives, but some of them even try to call themselves that, is that they have the same problem, fundamentally, that's the Democrats do. And I talked about this a little bit in the last segment. They don't really believe it. They'll tell you they believe these things, but they're just not so sure. And the problem with it is that they cannot let loose of the money. They don't believe that if you give people money back or not take as much of it, that there's a point where they'll spend more of it and you'll grow the economy. They just can't believe that. And the idea of leaving money on the table, which is how they see this, well, if we lower the tax rate, we're just leaving money on the table. First of all, it's not your money. Once again, it's like saying a bank robber. It didn't take all the money with them. But anyway, they just can't get past that. They don't really believe the economics of growth and capitalism. They just don't. And the idea that you would lower the rate and makes them think that we'll just get less money. And what are we going to do with less money? How will we fund, coloring books for transgenders in Peru? We just won't be able to do it. They just get hysterical at that. I believe that economics taken in an objective fashion, we'll see that there is an area, and a lot of this has to do with human nature, right? I mean, there's only so much you're going to do if most of it's going to someone else. And it's not only that it's going to someone else, but they don't share in your business or your salary, whatever the case may be. As I've said this before, it's like having a silent partner who takes profit but doesn't involve themselves in the risk. So the government gets, say, 60% of your earnings, but what if you have losses the next year? Do they give you that money back? No. It's just a one-way street. So while we need it, we need to understand what the basic services that we need are, how much they should cost, and what's the best way to generate income at a sort of a sweet spot where people will not mind paying taxes so much and feel comfortable spending money. I saw when I was researching this a little bit, some of the other economists had said, well, I don't know about that Laffer thing, One of them even said, I think the good tax rate might be up to 70%. 70%. Who wants to work for someone who's just idly by taking 70% of your salary? Especially when it gets harder and harder to see where that money goes. Either it goes places you can't figure out, or the places you do see it go to, you don't understand why it's doing it. So how can you possibly say that? Well, you're just numb, I think, when you do that. Just beware of people out there that tell you they're conservatives, and at the same time said, well, we have to pay for these tax cuts. So we're going to, really? You might at least consider paying for the tax cuts by hitting a tax rate that people feel comfortable with. We've all heard the story, because I've told it many times, that Ronald Reagan said about how in Hollywood, when he was still working there, this was after the Second World War, they had a tax rate of 90% on salaries, or rather earnings over $1 million. $1 million is a lot of money in 1949, 1950, right in there. And he said that what happened, I know I've said this so many times before, but it's just so instructive, is that the people who were making that much money, when they got to that point, they just quit working, because they're just not going to give 90% of their labor to somebody else. And that was fine, because they made a lot of money. In the meantime, all the people that worked on the movies or the entertainment or whatever else it was that don't make that kind of money were out of jobs, because these guys weren't going to spend any more money to make more money, because they just have to give it away. To me, that's so illustrative of what all this stuff comes up with. Just really listen to your representatives out there, especially when they talk about paying for tax cuts. What do you mean paying for tax cuts? Think about the logic of that. Paying for tax cuts. That's the assumption that there's a certain level that the government has to take, and if they lower it in one area, they have to raise it in another. I think that's just bad logic. I think it's bad economics, because it doesn't take into account the entire system. Anyway, there's a bunch of stuff on my notes here that just, those of you who have not been distracted aimlessly by the American Pope that we've had the news endlessly about, a couple other things, there's a lot of turbulence in the world, like we talk about. For instance, India and Pakistan are not getting along. This is not surprising. India and Pakistan have not got along for a long time. There is a disputed border area that they have near Kashmir and a couple other areas that I can't quite remember, that is just one of those places that everybody fights over. They fight over. Also, they don't like each other very much because of various cultural and religious types of things. So the whole thing is easy to have it get triggered. Now, remember, surprisingly enough, Pakistan is a nuclear power. I mentioned that earlier. So is India. Now, India, you're like, I guess they must have got it somewhere. Pakistan doesn't seem like it's a big player in the nuclear arena, but it is, and it's had nuclear weapons for quite some time. How it got them, kind of a long story. But the estimates are, and I always love these estimates because they don't tell you where they come from, is that the Indian government has about 172 nuclear warheads. I don't know who's counting them. And nuclear warhead doesn't tell you much because there's all sorts of kilotonnage that these things can render. So are they little ones, big ones? How many big ones? We don't know. But they also think Pakistan has like 170. Once again, I'm not sure how they get these numbers. But that's a lot. Even if they're small nukes, even if they're battlefield nukes, tactical nukes. And these guys, during the 80s, there were many people that thought that there was a higher chance of a nuclear exchange between Pakistan and India than between the United States and the Soviet Union. Simply because the two great powers really could see what would happen if they started exchanging ICBMs. Whereas in the smaller area, people can easily make mistakes and let fervor overcome their judgment, which is what might happen in Ukraine if we're not careful. So this is just rearing its head again. It's something to watch. Do I think that it's going to happen? There's going to be some exchange? No, really not. But it doesn't help world trade to have these guys fighting. And who knows? Every so often, as you may have noticed, some country or other gets a loon in charge. Let's just think of North Korea, for instance. And good sense, logic, reason, just out the window with those guys. So you can't predict that so well. So you have to keep our eyes on it and see what's really going on. Speaking of the loss of so many different things, here in Colorado, I know I'm touching on these things. We're just, like I said, for those of you that saw, what is it, Indiana Jones and was it the Crystal Skull? Is that the one? Where they're in the mountain and they're in that rail car that's going flying around and down and everything. That's what I feel like we're at in Colorado with our legislature. It's completely out of control. It's almost completely a one-party system now. Not quite. There's a little tiny edge there, but it's coming there. And what that does is it allows the true scope of the moronic behavior of the left to be revealed. And it also allows the sort of inherent biases that they have, that they try and cover up when they feel like that they're, in danger of losing power, to pop up. This week in Colorado, the Senate Majority Leader, who's of course a Democrat, was at an event and started mocking Christianity, and I won't even go into some of it, but it was very clear that he has a disdain for it. There was a time when a politician, even if they had some weird ideas like that, wouldn't say it because people just wouldn't put up with it. Now, they look around and say, we're pretty much in charge. We can say what we want, and this is how I feel. And I'm also appealing to my loon base because they need to hear this stuff. The fact that they can get away with things like that without having any real blowback is really as upsetting as their own attitude. So if people don't want to do something in this state that I'm at, and they may, who knows, there's been a time or two when people actually got together and did something kind of conservative and not fight with each other more than they do the Democrats. But it's possible. But you have to see these things out in the open. Now, one thing that happens is they don't get widely reported. We know why. So they don't want to stir the rubes up. Remember, that's the theory. Don't stir up the rubes. This is what happens with a lot of the media when you're looking at it from the leftish side of things. So we have to keep track of it ourselves. I mean, Colorado has, and some of you guys are on the same way. If you're like in Illinois or Michigan or someplace like that, you're careening to the same kind of thing we are, where you're turning into California just as fast as you can. Colorado has some of the most ridiculous gun laws, for instance, that got passed this last session and signed by our Governor Polis, who for some period of time kind of claimed he was a libertarian. I don't know why, a bolt of lightning doesn't strike him when he says that, but nevertheless. So we have these gun laws, we've talked about them before, that's on the books where next year, detachable magazines and firearms and so forth are supposedly become illegal to sell unless you go through some kind of training program and get a card. You won't be able to buy ammunition in the same way. It's, I think, probably, I know it's unconstitutional. Probably it will be found to be unconstitutional. I mean, not by our state Supreme Court probably, but, somebody else. It's just too much. comes to the Second Amendment. I mean, the Second Amendment's still in there. No matter how much they keep trying to erase it, it still is in there. But some of the ideas that didn't quite make it to the legislature in Colorado this year are things to think about for anybody in any state that wants to, kind of think about their rights, because they're all sideways attempts to attack firearms ownership. The question I have is, what are you planning on doing that you're so worried about everybody having some self-defense weapons? What? I mean, it's no longer that you're just blaming crime on the fact that people have guns. I mean, you do that regularly, but this is something else. For instance, one of the laws that they wanted to get going in the legislature, didn't quite get any traction this last year, was an armory bill. Now, this was just talk about, so wanted to have a law that regulated how many firearms you might have, and or if you have them, how many of them could be stored at your residence. And these are just sort of the contours of it. And then that you may have to provide information to the government if you have an armory in your home. Now remember, people who are writing gun laws like this don't know a revolver from a semi-automatic from a pointed stick. So Lord knows what they would come up with if allowed to do these things. They think that a firearm and a box of 50 rounds of ammunition is an armory. I don't know if you see these things. And they say, he was pulled over and he had a firearm and he had almost 200 rounds of ammunition in his possession. I think if you do a lot of hunting or target practice or things like that, it's not an absurd amount to have around. But these guys just, what do you need 200 rounds for? Well, you sometimes want to practice. You want to, I mean, come on. These are the people you want to be in charge of this kind of stuff. So these are some of the ideas. Now, I think some of those ideas are just blatantly, even to the worst federal, no, that's not true, to most of the federal circuits, it would be unconstitutional. You just can't keep trying to create these firearms registries, which is they're going to try and do by imposing some of the laws they already passed. They just want to know who's selling what, who has what, and where they're at. Why? Why has that become so important? I mean, like I said, I used to tell everybody, it's just because they want to blame firearms for all the crime. I still think that's true, but there's something else going on with these guys. And I'm not sure if it's calculated or if it's just some sort of mental health issue. But you have to watch this stuff. And if no one's going to report what's going on in your state legislature, not only in Colorado but other places, you're going to have to look for yourself because there's some loons out there. Anyway.
Hi, folks. Thanks
for listening. Stay positive. We'll see you next week.
Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickwagnershow.com. Both of them will take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.